People pay good money to see this movie. When they go out to a theater, they want cold sodas, hot popcorn, and no monsters in the projection booth.
Everyone pretend podcasting isn't boring.
Turn it off.
Professeur, comment voyez-vous la prochaine guerre? Elle sera comme je la voudrais.
Cette invention est susceptible de désamorcer tous les engins nucléaires. Celui qui détient l'annulator peut devenir le maître du monde impunément.
La vie des autres a cessé d'exister pour nous. Notre horizon s'arrêtera au mur de cette maison.
Sa fille Sylvaine, elle ne quitte jamais la maison. Nous devons la considérer comme le point faible de ce vieux fou.
Bye, bye, Mr. Spy. Va-t'en retrouver Argus, prince au sans-regard.
Se dissimuler est la première nécessité de notre métier.
Va au pays où se sont tus les silencieux.
Montrez-moi la couleur dernière des acides.
Quand tu iras au bal du mal, Mr. Spy, bye bye.
Welcome to the Projection Booth. I'm your host, Mike White. Join me once again is Ms. Samm Deighan.
Hello.
Also back in the booth is Mr. Axel Kohagen.
Greetings.
We are kicking off a month of science fiction fare with one film that is the least sci-fi of the bunch, The Unknown Man of Shandigor. Released in 1967, the film is a rare feature film from Swiss filmmaker Jean-Louis Roy. The film is something of a spy movie, which stars the singular Daniel Emilfork as Professor Herbert von Krantz, a scientist who has crafted a device called the Annulator, which can reverse a nuclear explosion. He, his assistant Yvan, and daughter Sylvaine are the targets of several spy rings, the Russians, the Americans, the French, and maybe the man with the platinum ring, who all want the Annulator or to destroy it. We will be spoiling this film if that's possible as we discuss it, so if you don't want anything ruined, go ahead and track down the beautiful restoration available via Deaf Crocodile, which happens to feature a commentary track from someone on this podcast that isn't Axel or me. So Sam, when was the first time you saw The Unknown Man of Shandigor, and what did you think?
Speaking of commentaries, it was because Deaf Crocodile reached out and asked me if I wanted to do a commentary for this film. And typically, I would say 90% of the time, if someone asks me if I want to do a commentary, it's either a film I already know or one that I watch before committing. But with Deaf Crocodile, that rule has gone out the window because they release films that are often so obscure that they're very hard to find. And so this one, once they described it to me, I was like, okay, that I do seem like a good fit for this, even if it's not a film I already know well, and fell immediately in love with it. And when did this come out? 2 years ago?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, so I've watched it again since then, and it's become one of my favorite Swiss films, which is, there's a low bar there. But I do really love this one.
And Axel, how about yourself?
I signed up for it and I wasn't sure what to expect. And I wasn't sure what I got either. After having watched it and listened to Sam's commentary, which is very good, I find that I have a healthy amount of appreciation for the film. It left me a little cold. I didn't feel as excited about it as I thought I would when I added up all the parts on paper, but I think it's a very good film that has a lot of elements that are worth noticing.
Listening to what you said, Sam, about when Deaf Crocodile asked you to do a movie, is there a similar rule, Axel, when I ask if you want to be on an episode or when I put the list out?
Yeah. It's gotten to the point where it's like, if Mike's got it, I'll watch it.
All right, cool. I feel like Deaf Crocodile. That's pretty awesome.
I think you have a pretty great track record of picking films that even if they're not always things I love, there's always a lot to talk about. And there are always things that are really interesting. And this definitely falls under that column.
This is one that I had heard of before Deaf Crocodile put it out, just because I'm a fan of Daniel Emilfork. I tracked it down. I think I downloaded it during some sort of free leech period on a particular site and never got to it. And this was really a way to kick my own ass into watching this movie, especially after it was a blind buy for me when the disc came out. I was just like, yep, let's go ahead. Got to pick this up, even though I still haven't seen it, but I know I'm going to love it. So let's do that. And then also supporting the cause, great commentary track on there. So I said, all right, let's do this up. And then, yeah, finally got around to watching it just a few weeks ago. And wow, it was worth the wait. And it was so fun to watch. And before I even say anything else, just the cinematography of this movie, so freaking gorgeous. This movie is just so lush. And the transfer looks so good. The restoration, which I don't think Deaf Crocodile necessarily did the restoration. Maybe Craig worked with them, but this was Cinema Suisse, the archives put this together, and it looks like it just came off of the printer. It looks so good. The way that the cigarette smoke is, the beautiful textures of the black and white, everything looks so nice. And it is just, this really fits into my sweet spot of like pop art and comic book based stuff. I was thinking of things like Diabolique. I was thinking of things like Who Wants to Kill Jesse. So it just is right there for me with just the beautiful look and the weirdo pop sensibility of this.
Yeah, that's how it is for me too. It's like in the middle of that sweet spot between weird European new wave. I would say French new wave, but it's like French new wave adjacent because it's Switzerland, but weird Euro new wave attempts at genre films I tend to really like. Like this reminds me a lot of Godard's Alphaville in a lot of ways. And so that's what I mean by new wave genre films. I am also a sucker for those kinds of 60s, 70s pop art, spy spoofs and spy thrillers. And this is definitely one of those. Plus it has Serge Gainsbourg, who I absolutely love. And that was one of the reasons when, as soon as they sent me this title and I looked at the description and saw that he and Howard Vernon and Daniel Emilfork were in it, I was like, yes, how have I not seen this already?
This is probably due to the fact that most of my interest in film has been in the horror genre, but I agree a lot with Sam on the commentary that there's a tremendous amount of gothic in this film. You've got the castle, the mad scientist, the innocent daughter, and everything to me seemed to come back to that. And I believe you also compared this filmmaking to the films of Jess Franco. And it also made me think of Jean Rollin, if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. And yeah, to me, I think having Howard Vernon in the type of role he's in, because Jess Franco, for anyone who isn't yet obsessed with him, just give it time. Jess Franco made some of the first sci-fi horror films, some of the first horror films in Spain. And he often cast Howard Vernon as the type of mad scientist that Daniel Emilfork plays here. And so that, I think, was just the automatic jump in my mind. But because it borrows from some of the same things that Jess Franco is borrowing from, like early French film serials, like crime film serials, things like Fantomas, definitely borrowing from Fritz Lang a lot. But I can also see the Jean Rollin a little bit because of the way it deals with these really eccentric figures in a castle and people who have these like love-hate relationships with each other that you can't quite always make out. Like the father and daughter relationship in this film is wild.
Yeah, I was reminded a little bit of Eyes Without a Face as far as that controlling father figure. Luckily, nothing too bad happens with Sylvaine. She doesn't have to have her face removed and replaced. But yeah, this whole idea of him creating the world within their castle, and he keeps saying, we don't need anything else. We don't ever need to go outside of these four walls. This is our domain. I really like that. And having the albino assistant who just creeps around, and you don't know if he's trying to help out all these spies or if Sylvaine maybe is trying to help out all these spies. You also have the lost love of Sylvaine as well. You find out about Manuel, and you're just like, okay, well, what's this story? Is this a forbidden thing? And that she eventually finds him again. I totally agree. There is a lot of the Gothic to this.
And Yvan is a monster in the sense of sometimes a monster is defined as something that is recognizably human and yet also considered inhuman at the same time. And the way the film treats his albinism makes him monstrous. And I'm not saying that being an albino makes you a monster, but I'm saying the movie codes it in that way to make him monstrous.
But really, the real monster is so much the Professor Emilfork's character, especially that he controls everything at that castle and that he's got that voice that he can project into any area. And it feels like this whole house is wired for sound and for video, and that he can spy on everything that's happening. He's such a control freak.
I love it, though. I think Daniel Emilfork is such a great actor. And I don't think I realized this until I did research for the commentary, that his parents were from Kiev, but fled to Chile, and that's where he grew up and started acting, but left because he was queer and didn't feel comfortable living there. But during his time there, became friends with people like Jodorowsky, and then, like so many of those South American surrealists, made his way to France. And it makes perfect sense considering the trajectory of his career. But he's one of those actors who has such strong charisma and such a unique look that he almost reminds me of a silent film actor. He's so perfectly cast here.
When I was watching it, I thought to myself several times, this guy looks exactly like the guy from City of Lost Children. But then I thought to myself, no, they can't be the same person because he would have aged between the two movies. That guy couldn't have looked like that way back when. And so I didn't even look it up. And then I got to your commentary and found out it was the same guy. And it can be the same guy.
He has that like John Carradine thing going on where you look old by the time you're 40, and so when you're like 70, you just look like you've been the same age for the last 30 or 40 years.
Emilfork is just so gorgeous. The shape of his head, the spaces between his teeth, the shape of that nose, and then those long fingers. During one of the earlier scenes, he's talking with his daughter, and his hand is over his face, and then he keeps opening up his fingers to look at her, to spy at her. And just, it looks like his fingers would wrap around his entire head. He just, oh my God, he's so striking. And anytime he shows up, and yeah, that was the first time I ever saw him, was City of Lost Children as well.
Same.
And it's funny because I know that Caro and Genet, that they also used Howard Vernon as a frogman in Delicatessen. I would not be surprised if they were familiar with this movie, because it feels like they pay homage to it in their movies because of the kind of wild sensibilities that they have and some of this cross-cutting. And it feels also very Chris Marker with the way that they're using still images throughout this whole film. There's a lot of debriefing of people, and so here's a whole slideshow of images. Like the first time, I think you see Howard Vernon at an airport when the plane comes in and all the bald men get off of the plane. And then you also get to see the Russian agent Shostakovich and his daughter. And he's reading a paper. He's got the little opera glasses. You get the introduction of these characters, but then when you get reintroduced to Howard Vernon, it's all through this slideshow. And for me, as I was looking at Vernon, I'm familiar with him, like you, Sam, through the Jess Franco stuff. There was a little Eddie Constantine to me. So again, bringing up Alphaville, yes. I was just like, oh, that was such a striking face. And all of these guys, Serge Gainsbourg has a very striking face as well. And then to have these bald assassins or all the guys with the same hats and everything, that just takes it into that real cartoonish level that I absolutely love. There's a great Indian film called Jailer, a Rajnikant film. And there's this joke of these 4 assassins that he has assigned to him that are all these big, muscle, bald guys. And they all dress the same throughout the entire movie. Every time you see them, they're all dressed alike. And it just so reminded me of this. While I was watching this, I was like, I wonder if they're familiar with that. But probably a coincidence. But that was just remarkable to see these bald guys and the way that they all like move in tandem. I love those kind of moments.
I love it so much, and they are extremely French. The way that the different spy groups break down between the Americans, the Russians, and the French, the bald black turtleneck wearing French spies, it's if Michel Foucault cloned himself and had this like school of philosopher spies. But the fact that they got Serge Gainsbourg here, such an icon. He basically, for anyone who doesn't know him, he's like the French David Bowie in that he wrote so many different kinds of music and was hugely popular and also wrote a lot of songs for other people. And I love that he did make his way into films too. But here he seems to just be having such a good time. And I almost automatically like any movie he's in because he does have that really striking face. I think he's a really beautiful man in a unconventional way, but he has such charisma and such presence, and I think it's the perfect addition of that kind of pop art, pop culture sensibility to this gothic sci-fi film. It's like just so well balanced.
How many cigarettes do you think he smoked in his lifetime?
1 million?
Easily, right?
Was there I think he probably was not smoking when he was asleep. This is a man who smoked cigarettes in the shower.
He was also in another one that kind of plays into this, though. It emphasizes the color, whereas this is so beautiful in black and white. He was Mr. Drugstore in Mr. Freedom as well,
yes.
Which came out in 1968. And that's another one. We talked about that years and years ago on this show and highly recommend it. Again, you're in a comic book, but a very different type of comic book than this movie is. And I would say this feels more comic strip than comic book, but definitely you feel the influences of comics on both of those.
I would say also he's in this bizarre Scottish set giallo film called Seven Deaths in the Cat's Eye, which Jane Birkin, his longtime partner, who RIP passed away last year, she stars in it. And there was a period where, the way that they got together is they met on the set of a film. And when she would appear or star in films, he would often show up and be on set because they were always together. And he has this strange role in Seven Deaths in the Cat's Eye as like an inspector or something, but it also, as much as a giallo film can feel influenced by those kind of fumetti Italian adult comics, it has that same kind of comic book vibe in a way that you don't often see in those kinds of stylized crime horror films. But yeah, so maybe he just brought that with him.
The other amazing face in this is Jacques Dufilo, I believe you would pronounce it.
Yeah.
He is Shostakovich, the head of the Russian spies. What an amazing face this guy has. And they just add to it with the monocle that they put in his eye and just again, the shape of his jaw, and he seems to know how to manipulate his instrument and just does such a great job of being comic, but also menacing at the same time. This was my first time, I believe, seeing him, and now I want to see more of this guy. Seen him before?
You've seen him. So he's somebody who started in more classic French cinema in the 40s and 50s, but he's the sea captain in Herzog's Nosferatu.
Okay.
He's worked with Louis Malle, Claude Chabrol, like a lot of big name French directors. But I think he, at least in my somewhat limited understanding of his career, I think he's the most noticeable when he's allowed to be in these like character actor type roles. But he's someone who I think did have a decent theater acting training, so he is able to change his appearance a little bit. He's great. And I love that the Russian spy's name is Shostakovich. It's amazing how you have so many of these guys who are really visually striking and really charismatic, but they don't drown each other out. They all sort of balance each other.
It is very nice because a lot of times it feels like there's a few different movies going on, not necessarily movies, but the threads are very distinct, and that you do get nice passages where you get him or any of these spy masters basically being able to chew up the scenery a little bit as they talk about their plans and their motivations to their spy rings. The whole thing of Gainsbourg when he's talking with those bald spies and he's doing the symbol on the wall and talking about the layout of the castle where the professor is. I love things like that. And for whatever reason, and this is probably really reaching, that symbol that he paints just was a little obsessed with that. And I kept thinking of Père Ubu, and I know that's very different. It's the circle, the spiral that's on Père Ubu's chest, but just something about that, or maybe it was, I will butcher this, and I wish that Heather was here to help me out with this, that Einstraib Neubauten
Einstürzende Neubauten.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I just said.
It is. So just copy what I said and just lower the pitch a lot. Yeah. I do think that there might be a little bit of intentional nod towards Père Ubu because definitely a lot of the people involved in making this film were either familiar with or involved with surrealism. And I know that Jean-Louis Roy, the director, had pretty eclectic tastes. He mostly made these documentaries that were more experimental and often dealt with subject matter that was transgressive or taboo. It wouldn't shock me if he was familiar. I would be actually surprised if he wasn't familiar with Père Ubu and some of that surrealist theater.
Well, what did you find out about Roy as you were doing your research on this? Because he's a mystery for me.
He's someone who I think is one of the few Swiss directors to be involved in this kind of Swiss cinema new wave revival movement that happened in the late 60s. I think the most famous of them is Alain Tenet, this director who's done a lot of French art house films, but he started in television. And he, I think, was involved as a sound engineer and a producer and was able to do more experimental things from an earlier age because he was in Swiss TV. And I think because it was the early decades of TV, they were like, sure, make some weird documentaries. It almost reminds me a little bit of someone like Ken Russell, who was able to explore some of his interests and do it through television documentaries and have that be a springboard for his feature films. But I think it was just such a weird time to be a director, especially in Switzerland, because I think they tend to be associated with whatever country their dominant language is. So for anyone who doesn't know, Swiss identity is divided by whether you're French Swiss, German Swiss, Italian Swiss. there are like unique Swiss languages that are spoken by very small groups of people. So somebody like Jean-Luc Godard, who is also Swiss, because he moved to France to make movies, even though he would jump back and forth between the two and made a bunch of Swiss productions, nobody, unless you're Swiss, no one calls him a Swiss director. He's a French director. And so I think because there wasn't this really robust cinema scene, you have this small group of guys called the Group of Five that involves Jean-Louis Roy and Ellen Tenet, who wanted to do something maybe more experimental, more in line with the new wave. But I think a lot of them wound up getting kicked to France because they were French-speaking Swiss directors. But I really would, I don't know that this would ever happen. I don't know if the elements survive, but he apparently made documentaries in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s on things like queerness and trans people and lots of subjects that I could never imagine seeing on television in the 70s. So it would be great if someone would find a way to release those somehow or even make them available streaming, because it seems like his films are pretty difficult to get a hold of. So hopefully someone will restore more of them.
According to IMDb, he only directed a handful of things, and I know that's not true. You go on Wikipedia, there's a whole lot more listed. And then he also worked with, it sounds like he worked with different cinema groups, so it'd be him and other people at the same time.
Yeah, which also does remind me of what the experimental new wave directors like Godard were doing, was working together in a group. But there is this other film that I really have been wanting to get a hold of called Blackout, which sounds like a companion piece to Unknown Man of Shandigor. It's about this older couple who basically lock themselves in their house, either because a nuclear fallout has happened, or I think it's that they're afraid it's going to happen. And there are just so many films from the late 60s that deal with this idea of atomic terror. But if you think about something like Unknown Man of Shandigor in comparison to Dr. Strangelove, this is such a different, much weirder thing. More sinister, definitely, at times.
Yeah, because you would think to invent something that can literally reverse a nuclear blast, that would be such a thing that we would want. But then at the same time, the Russians, the Americans, the French, it feels like they're all trying to get that to destroy it rather than to use it. Because if you take away the threat of nuclear power, what are you left with? Nothing.
You're not in power anymore.
Right. Which was such a scary way of having and attaining power, is having this nuclear arsenal.
I have to admit that this red herring really threw me for a loop. I was so fixated on the idea of this nuclear bomb diffuser that it took me a while to go all the directions the film wanted to go. I just kept thinking, we're going to get back to this. And I don't know if it's because I grew up in the 80s where we were all convinced we were going to get exploded, but I really locked in on that.
I was definitely thinking that there's going to be more about that from the beginning as well, just with that very it's one of the most striking images that you can have is the nuclear explosion. And to your point, Sam, it almost feels like we ended Dr. Strangelove, then we begin Unknown Man of Shandigor, and it just reverses all those nuclear explosions. And then it carries on with, oh, you did this thing. And he's, oh, yes. Yeah, I love that opening press conference, and especially where they're like, who do you admire? And he's like, Dracula.
It's one of those films that, and you mentioned this a while ago, this idea that not that it's different films in one, but that it does have these very distinct threads and subgenres almost that it follows. And so I think if you go into it expecting European version of Dr. Strangelove, you're going to be disappointed because it really seems to follow these different subgenres down these kinds of rabbit holes. And it's as much a gothic black comedy or gothic horror film as it is a nuclear terror movie as it is a spy spoof. What made me love it is how unpredictable it feels.
Interestingly, that's what drove me nuts about it is all of those rabbit holes and all of those different genres he was pursuing. He was very successful at. If he had gone straight gothic, he would have done a great job. If he would have done a straight spy thriller, it would have been a great straight spy thriller. If he had done a straight comedy, it would have been a great straight comedy. So every time the film took another turn, I found myself wanting to keep following that. So his talent made me want a whole lot more from this movie than any movie could ever deliver. He just has this ability to resolve problems like he's something, a small item that has many uses that, I don't know, like a knife that has, my Swiss Army knife joke didn't work, so I'm going to stop now. I thought I was going somewhere with that. I thought I had a bit, and I didn't have a bit, and so I'm gonna be quiet.
It's a Swiss Army Annulator, or in some translations, I think they call it a canceller in some of the earlier English language writing about it, but the Annulator sounds better. But it really is a MacGuffin. It's just a reason to bring you into his castle and a reason to get all these spies together. But it seems like that's the case in the majority of spy spoofs and spy thrillers, is like whatever this main device is, it doesn't really matter to the plot. It's just bringing people together. Although here, it also seems to connect to some unseen creature. So there's a little Lovecraftian.
I will say that this movie plays better the second, third, fourth times that you see this because of what you were saying, Axel, as far as the left and right turns that we're constantly taking and being rabbit holed down these other areas with, here's the Americans and they're doing their target practice. Here's the French and they're doing the element of surprise or disguise. I love that disguise scene when the guy's going back and forth behind the screen and changing.
It's so good.
Oh, it's so good. And yeah, you've got all of these things and then introducing Manuel and then the man with the platinum ring. And just like the man with the platinum ring comes up so late in the movie, but you're like, okay, by that time you're all right with it because you have been wrong-footed so many times. Not wrong-footed, just taken down these paths so many times. Seeing it the second time, I was like, oh, okay. So there is not necessarily a logic to this, but it definitely plays better the second time when you realize that there are all of these groups. Because at first viewing, I was just like, oh, now there's this group, and now there's this group, and now there's this, and who are these people? But yeah, I really recommend that you watch this multiple times because you get more and more out of it each time, I believe.
I would agree with that. And I think that's something that tends to happen to me. I don't know if it's like this for you, but when I do a commentary on something, if it's not already a film I really love when I start, usually just the act of doing all this research and thinking about what's going on in all of these scenes and what are the larger themes and how does the film function, I usually wind up falling in love with it. And that definitely happened to me here. And I think it made those shifts in tone and genre and direction more exciting when I started to think about all the influences he's pulling from and how he's just seemingly putting some of his favorite things from European cinema in a blender and letting Howard Vernon take the wheel.
Even the scene when they're in the rock quarry and they're doing all of the target practice, I was like, is this a reference to the end of Orson Welles' The Trial? Because again, beautiful black and white cinematography and just these guys in this rock quarry and stuff. I don't think that there was a direct correlation, but it's been so nice for me over the last month and a half being able to watch all of these just absolutely gorgeous black and white films. I would say that you are looking at two of the most beautiful black and white films between The Trial and this one. And I think even if you don't enjoy the story of this, you will enjoy the beautiful look to it. But I think that the story is super compelling as well.
There are so many different, really striking set pieces. There's a scene where Howard Vernon's in a museum, and there are these moments where you forget about the plot because you're so caught up in looking at the visual world of the film, which is definitely something that happens with these comic strip, crime serial influenced films. It's like the visual world is so surreal, hyper real, that it's such a big part of the pleasure of watching these films in this kind of loose subgenre, for me anyway.
I find it very funny, too, that one of the last times we talked, Sam was talking about another beautiful black and white film with Shura by Matsumoto. Just absolutely, again, striking black and white photography. And then to talk about another Japanese filmmaker, Teshigahara, that he did that wonderful documentary about Gaudi's work. And then you get Park Gruel in this film, and utilizing Park Gruel's otherworldly Gaudi architecture. And it's so striking. As soon as we get to, and that's actually Shandigor itself, when Sylvaine, what is it? She gets kidnapped and taken there?
Yes.
Yeah. When she shows up and I see that architecture, I'm just like, I've been here before. What is this place? And then I realize, oh, it's Park Gruel right there in Barcelona. Just, man, oh man. If anybody within the sound of my voice has the opportunity to go to Barcelona, I highly recommend it. And just to go there and see how great it is, and to see, because that's a wonderfully colorful park, but to see it just in the stark black and white of this film, it is just remarkable.
In a way, it reminded me of things like Last Year at Marienbad, and even, I know it's a couple of years after this, but something like Bertolucci's The Conformist, where they both use these really striking real world locations, but the way that they're shot and the stories and the narratives that take place there make them feel so otherworldly. And here he does such incredible work at making all these different scene locations so distinctive and serve the story so incredibly. But that Gaudi location is definitely, it's like he knew what he was working with. I wonder how he got permission to shoot there, or if that's difficult or was difficult in the late 60s.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm curious too, and I don't know if you were able to find this out, how the film was actually received when it came out.
From what I found, when it came out in Switzerland, the main thing I remember was that the criticism was that it didn't feel Swiss, which is incredible criticism, incredible/awful. But I want to say it represented Switzerland at Cannes that year, but I think it's something that people just didn't really understand. And when you think about what happened with Jean-Louis Roy's career in comparison to someone like Godard, because Godard started off famous essentially with his first 2, 3, 4 films, I think it gave him license coming out of the new wave, coming out of Cahiers du Cinema as a film critic. It gave him license to be a little more experimental. And so I think if Alphaville had been his first film, it wouldn't have gotten any attention. People would have said, what the hell is this? And so I think a similar thing happened to Roy, except because he didn't already have that clout and that reputation. It's like with Godard, some of the films he made around this period in the mid to late 60s, they're really out there and really experimental, very visually striking, deal with very similar themes as Unknown Man of Shandigor, sometimes in different ways. But because he had this cult following, people were just willing to go with him for a while and would acclaim whatever he put out. And so I think as a contrast, it's interesting to see what happens to a director like Roy, who people don't know, who is doing something similarly visually striking, dealing with politics in a similar way and world events. And it's just, it doesn't land because people don't know how they're supposed to feel about it. They don't know, oh, this director's a master, so we have to like this film. They're just like, what is this weird sci-fi garbage? And why is there a monster?
Axel, I was thinking that the last time you and I talked was also about an absolutely gorgeous and avant-garde black and white film as well, with Heroic Purgatory, which was just another one where using that black and white, but definitely much less traditional framing, let's say. This does not necessarily frame everything the way that you would think it is, but definitely not as avant-garde as we saw in Heroic Purgatory.
With Heroic Purgatory, the first time through watching it, to be honest, I don't think I could have hated it more than I did the first time watching it, and was furious. And I turned it off, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. And I watched it a second time. I think I ended up watching that one 2.5 times, and realizing that somehow I really liked it. With this movie, I would say there were like a dozen points in the movie that delighted me. Labette and the spy face-off in the museum, and as you mentioned in the sheet for this, the lineup of spies on the top of the building. Just the whole way the mysterious man with the platinum ring shows up. It's like a greatest hits compilation, but I just didn't end up liking it as much as the often punishing Heroic Purgatory.
It's funny that you bring Yoshida up, who directed Heroic Purgatory. There was a retrospective of his films in New York in December, so I got to see a lot of things. I think I made it to 6, 7, 8 films. And so I got to see them all on 35 in a theater. And it's a very similar experience where a lot of the time these are long films. They're 2.5, sometimes 3 hours. And there are parts where you resent him and you're like, what are you doing to me? But the visuals are just so singular and so incredible that I do wonder, and maybe he made one that I don't yet know about, but I do wonder what would happen if he had made more sci-fi tinged films like Teshigahara did, and definitely like Unknown Man of Shandigor, because his control over these unusual, experimental, but just unforgettable images, I think there are definite parallels to Shandigor in the way that some of them are just really jarring and you're like, what am I seeing? But it also is visual poetry.
And they both have that sense of using real life settings to make them seem odd and futuristic as well. And I thought that was on full display and excellent in Heroic Purgatory.
Yeah, I totally agree, especially those scenes like the hanging of the one character and just the way that the buildings are around him. That smokestack, I seem to remember, or that ditch where you saw people running down quite often. Yeah, he definitely did some very interesting things with that. And every shot in Shandigor just is so pretty to me. And they seem to know when, especially to put things in, foreground, midground, background, like things like the spies when they're shooting the building and everything. You've got all those reeds and you've got the guy with the camera behind the reeds. You're getting all of that depth of field. And again, it just feels like these images are... There's a shot when Shostakovich is smoking a cigarette and just the smoke is trailing out from the cigarette. It is so nice. And I'm just like, this is from 1967. This feels like it was made today. That's how nice this print looks. And I was really surprised that they were able to dig up for the Deaf Crocodile release, that Cinema Vif special, like a half an hour special all around the making of this film with interviews with, the Sylvaine and Emilfork and the gentleman that plays Shostakovich, as well as the director, as well as behind the scenes footage of them actually shooting things. I'm just like, this is amazing that they were able to find this and get it subtitled and have it on the disc. it's better than half of the making of documentaries that you see today.
And it's something that really confused me why it was made at all.
Right.
Because I think...
Who makes that about this movie? Yeah.
And it's like these sorts of making of documentaries or even just like featurettes that I wish existed for so many films. It seems like people didn't really get into doing that until more recent decades. So the fact that there's this 1967 film that they were like, yeah, let's do a featurette. But I have to wonder if that was because he worked in television and maybe just had that sort of mindset going in. Like he didn't make a ton of films, or at least didn't make a ton of films that got attention, and thought, you know what, I'm just going to interview people while we're here.
I would love to know the provenance of the actual making of documentary. And
yeah, me too.
I want to say there was a French release of the film, maybe French, maybe Swiss, a few years ago that also had a few extras on there that weren't ported over to the Deaf Crocodile release. Unfortunately, I could not find subtitles for those, but I would love to check that out as well. And then to your point, Sam, more of his films would be great. He did one, I can't remember what the award was, but it was from 1964. It was called Happy End, but not the Aldrich Lipsky Happy End from 1967. But that I was able to find fairly readily. But again, no English subtitles. And I think that those are required for these movies.
Some of these are just, it's like they're out there, but not in a way that's easy to watch.
Mm-hmm.
And I was hoping that maybe more of his films would see the light of day, because I think this Unknown Man of Shandigor release was pretty popular and did sell pretty well. At least I think it got good reviews, good attention. But Deaf Crocodile, there are so many great Blu-ray companies of all sizes working right now with their own different niches and specialties. But the fact that they intentionally seem to look for these mostly very obscure, mostly European films, they're really doing such an incredible service, like rescuing some of these things. And they do seem to have really great luck finding amazing special features. And I don't mean even newly created things like commentaries or video essays or anything like that, but like finding archival special features. It really is incredible that making of exists. But hopefully they'll maybe get a hold of some more Roy films. Fingers crossed.
That would be wonderful. Yeah, they're doing such a good job right now with Russian science fiction or fantasy films, and then, of course, bringing my boy Aldrich Lipsky here with so many releases as well. It makes me very happy. I really can't say enough nice things about them. And yeah, that they take such care with their releases. And even I think it was new poster artwork that they had commissioned for it. It looks really nice. And you can see the roots of it in some of the older posters as well.
It also, I think, really reflects the quality of the almost like silvery quality of the film, at least as it looks in the restoration. And something I was going to say when you were talking about this earlier, but this is one of those movies that does have such gorgeous cigarette smoking scenes that even though I haven't smoked in years and hope to never do so again, sometimes watching movies like this, I'm like, would it be so bad to just have one? Shostakovich is making it look so good.
I believe it was on that making of featurette when I got to see Roy speak a little bit. He reminded me of Sam Raimi in terms of his obvious passion for the subject combined with do it yourself, almost a chip on the shoulder. I can get this movie done, because he was talking quite a bit about just the fact that he was making a Swiss movie was revolutionary in its own way, because people didn't expect that it could happen. And I saw the same sort of fire of innovation in both directors.
If you have a country, especially a smaller country, who doesn't make many films, when directors do start making films there, I think there's this unusual pressure to make a film that represents the country in some way. I've definitely seen this happen in, say, South American cinema, where it's like, why are you making this genre film? This doesn't have anything to do with our culture or our values. But of course, in a way it does. And so to see him do something like this, it feels like such a mature work from someone who genuinely, as you just pointed out, loves cinema so much and clearly consumes a lot of it from a lot of different places. One of the things I find really frustrating with contemporary genre films is when they are more art house and try to do something that's quote unquote elevated, it winds up just feeling like a pastiche, or you're just ripping off something better that came before. But with Unknown Man of Shandigor, it manages to combine so many influences, like, those French film serials and Fritz Lang and even some Hitchcock and things like Eyes Without a Face that we mentioned, but it doesn't feel like he's ripping anyone off because it's so unique and so surprising, all these like twists that he takes. And while Axel said, I think it's not for everyone and it's something that you have to get used to or maybe have more of an appetite for, like I now do, it's such an one-of-a-kind experience.
We should talk too about the music for this, done by Alphonse Roy, who was Jean-Louis' father, professional flautist, I believe, but also might have been a conductor as well, and he wrote the music for this, except for basically it's like a music video in the middle of this.
Bye, Mr. Spy.
Yes, it was so good. I'm like, here it comes. And I looked all around for a Gainsbourg compilation that would have that on it, but so far I have not been able to find any. But what a delightful little break in the film.
I don't know why it doesn't seem to be available. My assumption is that he was just so prolific and has so many albums and wrote so many, like I said, one-off songs for other people, especially female singers, that became hits that if you try to find, especially online, if you try to find his music now, there's just so much of it that I think these kinds of what you would think of as like a B-side or more niche songs, I don't know if this is collected anywhere, which is a shame because it's delightful.
We should also say there's some really good torture scenes in this, or defensive scenes, like the one bald spy who comes in to the professor's lair, and the way that he gets him locked into a room and then gasses him, and the gas will dissolve him. And then later on, you get Yvan in a room with all of this foam coming up from the bottom, and it's supposed to also torture him as well. I love those types of scenes because it's just silly effects, but they're used very well for this.
It's very comic book.
Oh, yeah.
And more in the tradition of European comics geared towards adults rather than what we think of as fluffy kids comic books. But I love the stuff like that in this film and in other spy spoof and spy thriller films because it feels so creative. Mm-hmm. It's, okay, we could kill you in a conventional way, but instead we're bringing out the foam torture. That's why I want to watch movies, to see something I haven't thought of and not to just see 87 versions of the same thing.
Begin the unnecessarily slow dipping mechanism.
Exactly.
I loved the scene where he was deciding to liquefy the spy. I loved it when, they were torturing Yvan with American music. And that the problem, and it's not the filmmaker's problem, it's entirely my problem. The problem I had with the foam is I just kept thinking about in the early 2000s, whenever clubs would have foam nights and like all these people in their 20s dancing to hard dance beats as foam was around them. And I kept picturing at any given moment, someone would drop the bass and it would become a European dance party
This guy with 2 glow sticks, a cat in a hat. He comes walking through.
Yep.
Lots of people on E.
Yes. Love you, man.
But with all the twists and turns that this movie takes, would it have been that surprising if a torture scene turned into a dance scene?
No.
Probably not.
No. And we should probably talk, too, about who the actual Unknown Man of Shandigor is. When, of course, this movie came out and I saw Emilfork all over the place, I was like, he's the man. He's got to be this unknown man. No, it's not. It's Manuel, but is it actually Manuel? Is Manuel, or is he the spy from the Platinum Ring gang? Is that him the entire time? Because that's how we end it. I don't know. What do you guys think about who this titular unknown man is?
It gave me kind of the way they end things with this, like, these Japanese spies coming in, or at least East Asian spies from this, like, Black Sun organization. It gave me Fu Manchu vibes. I do think the influence comes partly from Fritz Lang's Mabuza series, where you have this guy who's able to, and certainly Fantomas is the same way, this guy who's able to take on all these disguises and be unknown and faceless to a degree, in the background pulling the strings. But because you start off knowing that there are French, Russian, and American spy groups, and the fact that he introduces this one basically at the end, it did give me those sort of Fu Manchu feelings. But Manuel is clearly up to no good. And we should also talk about Manuel for a second, who he does remind me of this early Velvet Underground, another kind of pop culture reference, even if totally unintentionally. And I think you see that in films from this period where you have these more traditional looking spy thriller characters, and then you have these kind of younger pop culture characters thrown in. And because Manuel is this love interest, it's not surprising that, of course, it's revealed at the end that he might have nefarious intentions. But something that I learned when doing research for the commentary that I cannot get out of my head is Ben Carruthers, who is an American actor. He's in Cassavetes films. He's all over the place. But there's this rumor, and because of the comic book elements of Unknown Man of Shandigor, I think that's why I fixated on it. There's this rumor that Angie Bowie wanted Ben Carruthers to star in a Daredevil Black Widow TV series with her, and like she bought the rights to the comics and it was in development and then it never went anywhere. But can you imagine an American TV series, like a cross between the Batman series and Unknown Man of Shandigor? Because that's what and maybe a dash of Danger Diabolic, but it's one of those things that is lost to history. But if I had a time machine, this series would be made.
Like Andy Warhol's Batman and Robin.
Yes. And I wonder if maybe that's why Angie Bowie had that idea, competing a little bit, maybe.
We have been talking so much about comics and comic book movies and comic influenced movies. And let's say 5 years ago, I found that the whole comic book movies are taking over argument was very disingenuous, just because I was like, this is just a fad. We go through waves. There was a time where it was spy thrillers, and spy thrillers were everywhere. This is a prime example of that as well. Even you could say Diabolic fits into that, but then you had all the James Bond, all the James Bond knockoffs. You had Mad Helm. You had, gosh, I'm trying to remember, like all of these different spy characters. And that was the same. You go back to Mabuse, and there were spy movies back then as well. You just go through waves when it comes to these genres. And yeah, you think about, well, what was on TV? Batman and Robin, and you had the Green Hornet, and then in the 70s you had the Hulk, and you had Wonder Woman, you had all of these things. So it's, come on guys, it's not just one thing that takes over. It might take over for a minute, but don't worry about it, Martin Scorsese. You will definitely get back to more traditional cinema as we go along.
But when it comes to comic book cinema, I would much rather watch these 60s and 70s films than anything made now.
I still enjoy quite a few of them, but as we're in the world where things like Ant-Man, Quantumania, and Madam Web and Morbius are around, yeah, I can definitely see that.
Also, I think it's just a different approach when you're making something like Unknown Man of Shandigor that has these really deep, wide-ranging influences from literature and art and cinema and music, of course. And as we've been saying, so much is put into the development of these visual worlds. I think for me, there's just, while I do find some of the recent comic book films, and by recent, let's say last 20 years, while I do find some of them entertaining, there's nothing in any of those films that feels like an art film in the way that Shandigor does, or Danger Diabolik, or even some of the spy spoofs. It's just such a far cry from having these teams of people with a lot of different talents and interests making a film that isn't just supposed to be this kind of mainstream appeal to everyone, throwaway CGI fest.
I can definitely agree with that, especially because it doesn't feel like we are pushing the genre at all or playing with things. And there are times where there is some play with the genre, things like Ragnarok or some of the Guardians of the Galaxy movies play with that a little bit. But yeah, nowhere near this. It feels like we are missing that person or group of people that will take the medium and push it in a different area or try different things. And maybe there are a bunch of superhero films that I'm not aware of that are playing with this stuff, but are just not Marvel or DC, so they get lost in the mix. And things like that one with Vin Diesel a few years ago, Blood something. It was like the last movie I saw in the theater before the world shut down during the pandemic. I was like, this was not a good movie to go out on because it was just so rote and you could tell everything that was going to happen. And I was like, really? I wish that I had gone out on a high note.
Yeah, bring us back to 1967.
And yeah.
Funny, irrelevant story about movies and COVID. The last movie I saw in the theater before COVID was a re-release of King Kong. And the first movie I saw after the theaters had opened up again was King Kong versus Godzilla. So that actually turned out perfectly.
It's also hard to deny the enduring power of King Kong, which was the first movie to make me cry as a child.
Now, here's my question to you. This is a little off topic. How offensive are the portrayals of the tribe on Skull Island? Because I've got a 7.5-year-old daughter and I want to put on King Kong for her, but I'm trying to decide how to kind of say, hey, maybe that's not the best portrayal.
I think even talking about something like Unknown Man of Shandigor and some of these other spy spoofs and genre films from certain decades, a lot of them revolve around these stereotypes. It's like you can draw a clear line from the stereotypes in King Kong, where anyone who isn't American is just ridiculous or monstrous, through to something like these 60s spy films, where a lot of them are still based in nationalism. It's all Russians are evil and nefarious and out to poison you, and all French people are ridiculous and smoke cigarettes and wear turtlenecks. I think if there's a way you can point out this is a stereotype that is harmful but is used so frequently in this genre, I don't think it's so over the top offensive that, but I also don't have kids, so maybe I'm the wrong person to ask.
Yeah, I would think that, because to me, the tribe in King Kong doesn't feel like it's Africans or African Americans, especially. It feels like it's more like an isolated tribe someplace.
That's made up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Made up whole cloth. And there are still groups of people that have very little to no outside contact with the rest of the world. To me, those people on Skull Island are pretty much exactly the same. I don't know. I wouldn't hesitate necessarily, as long as you give a little caveat, suppose. I don't think there needs to be a trigger warning for that one.
The reason that it doesn't bother me as much as, let's say, the Italian cannibal movies of the 70s, not that you would be showing those to a 7-year-old, but for obvious reasons. But it's like, because those try to tie themselves to actual tribes and actual places in the world, they feel more offensive than Skull Island is this fantastical place that doesn't exist. So I think it also reminds me of what's going on with Mothra and the tribe that worships her. It's just so fantastical that even though it is based in some offensive stereotypes, it's not as bad.
Sam, I know you're a very intelligent person, so I'm going to forgive that you said Skull Island does not exist.
I'm sorry.
In my heart, it does.
In my heart, it does too.
Okay.
It doesn't, I should have said, it doesn't exist on any known maps, much like the Loch Ness Monster, who is on a known map, but who I'm convinced exists.
I'll support you in that.
I was glad too that the Black Sun, that's not overly racist. It's just that these happen to be, and I want to say with Black Sun, I want to say they're Japanese as opposed to Chinese.
Yeah, I think they're supposed to be Japanese. I think it's Black Shining Sun, maybe.
And you get that irony of them going after this Annulator when Japan, how long does the Annulator last? Could they go to Hiroshima and undo the damage there? It just made a lot more sense for me that they would be Japanese and coming in and doing this. And they seem to be the most together group that there is. I mean, we see the one guy who I don't know if it's him that dies or if there's another guy, or because I assume that Manuel, when we see the platinum ring on his hand at the end, that he is a Japanese person just in disguise, because we've seen these people able to change into a Chinese person and a black person and a woman and a singer and all those things. I love that scene of the disguises, but it feels like, okay, I'm not sure if that's the same spy, if it's another one from the same organization, because we have the one guy who wears the kamikaze suit who gets blown up into absolute dust. Again, I guess I'm thinking of The Trial too, with that explosion. And yeah, it just, I like that they come in at the end and just, they're the ones who aren't incompetent. They seem to be the ones that really know what the hell's going on, as opposed to these guys who are just murdering each other wantonly. The massacre in the bowling alley is one of my favorite scenes in the film, especially the guy crashing through the pins. And I love that's the Americans are the ones that their headquarters is in a bowling alley. It's so great.
It is perfect. And the way that it plays out, where this Black Sun organization is just sitting back, manipulating things, but also waiting for these vindictive idiots to kill each other off. It's such a great way to end the whole thing, where I know this is a trope that you see in comic books and crime serials, where it's this sort of male love interest. It appears to be a good guy, appears to be heroic, but it's really just a disguise. It's like they wait so long to show you his ring and to give you the sense that, okay, maybe he's with Sylvaine for not so romantic reasons. Almost ends it on a cliffhanger note, the way that a lot of the crime serials end. And so I just love the way that ends.
First of all, never trust a guy who reminds you of Lou Reed. Secondly, the scene where the first agent from the Black Sun shows up was just perfect genre moment of, all right, you've known all these different groups that have been fighting, and now here comes the real deal. I love that trope in movies where you go through 2/3 of the movie and then they introduce something that's even worse than what you've seen before. It keeps the last third of the movie from becoming stale.
It's a great twist to have that, and it does come right at the right time and just, shows you the difference in the professionalism. I love that he comes out of the sea and then he goes back in, and then it seems like there's this whole layer out there because he crawls down that ladder and then it's just hallways again. It just goes on forever. I'm like, where was this? And then also we should say, we've mentioned Labette a few times and never really talked about it. The professor just has a sea monster that's out in his garden that they have to feed. And I don't even know what they're feeding this thing, but something that requires him to wear these thick gloves when he's throwing the food into it. And you can just see it coming as he's on the edge. He's lost Yvan, he's lost Sylvaine, and he's there feeding the bet. And I'm just like, this monster's going to get him. And sure enough, he just goes ass over tea kettle into the drink. And
I was just going to say into the drink.
Yep. That's the last time we see him.
But it's also such a great way to not let anyone win, in a sense.
Yeah.
It's like the professor doesn't win because he gets eaten by his own sea monster. And you don't get, and I think this is also a very Swiss thing to do. The Americans, the Russians, and the French, none of them get to win either. It's the secret other East Asian, probably Japanese group who appears, and because they're the most competent, they take the reins. And I really liked that because I think there are a lot of spy spoofs and spy thrillers that have interesting political subtext or overt text a lot of the time. But the way that those films are made often says a lot about the countries in which they're made, especially if they're meant to be more mainstream films. Like the way that you always have Bond winning, it's really just a symbol of Britain wanting to maintain their imperial power. Whereas here, because it's made by this experimental Swiss television director, no one in Europe is winning. Certainly the United States is not, and I find that very satisfying.
And I love that at the end when Yvan has been tortured and there's this whole thing about this film that contains the plans and, he sent it over to this person. He'll never be able to get it back. When he comes back to the villa and finds that the post office has returned the package because there wasn't enough postage or they don't ship things like that, I think it was. He ends up with the package again. That's so silly, but so perfect for this film.
Yeah, the use of humor is great.
It was a very Coen Brothers moment,
Yes.
I thought.
I could totally see that, yeah. And I love the gadgets that they have through this whole thing, too. Like when he then goes to a phone booth and he's, hey, this happened. And you've got the man with the platinum ring outside and he's got that thing that looks like a big projector or a major flashlight, and he's able to just focus in and get the conversation from Yvan to the Howard Vernon character. I just love those little things. Like you said, perfect spy movie as well.
It's so many things all at once.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's go ahead and take a break and play a preview for next week's episode right after these brief messages.
Bježimo. Molim te, Roberte, bježimo.
Se, neće nam ništa.
Zašto si je doveo? Željeli smo kontakt s tobom. Reci joj zašto si me doveo. Reci.
Ta će nam zakomplicirati situaciju.
Idem.
Čekaj.
Ne smije otići.
Još uvijek to ne znaš, Targo.
Drugi put je ne vodi sa sobom. Zašto se bojiš? Nismo tvoji. Nitko ti toliko ne pripada kao mi.
Biba. Biba. Čuješ li me, Biba?
Ona te ne može čuti. Privremeno je promijenila oblik.
Tu imaš srce?
Da, kao svako.
Mi nemamo srce. Jesi li sisavac?
Pa, da.
Sisavac, i to prilično primitivan. Targo.
Pa rekla si da stanovnici ove planete imaju mali koeficijent razvoja.
Da. Ali u Robertu morate vidjeti ja koje je stvorilo čitavu galaksiju Arkana i našu planetu Tugador.
To je lijepo od njega, ali da je na višem stupnju razvoja mogle su naše oči imati paralasere. A naš mozak je mogao imati međugalaktički intuitivni centar. Danas to svatko ima.
Next week, we're discussing yet another film from Deaf Crocodile with a look at Visitor from the Arcana Galaxy. Until then, I want to thank my co-hosts, Axel and Sam. So, Sam, what is the latest with you, ma'am?
I started a new podcast, which is called Eros Plus Massacre, and you can find it on the Cinepunks network. Yeah, I should have probably brought this up when we were talking about Yoshida earlier, because he's definitely the inspiration for my podcast, but it will mostly be focused on cult and psychotronic cinema, but also a lot of art house, weirder, more unusual mainstream movies. My first episode is on Michele Soave and his first few Italian horror films like Stage Fright and The Church. And you can find that either on my Patreon or on Cinepunks. Also, I co-edited this book called Revolution in 35mm that is up for pre-order. Mike kindly wrote an essay for it, and that will be out in the fall.
And Axel, how about yourself?
First of all, I'm definitely going to be tuning in to hear Sam talk about The Church, as I absolutely love that movie. Secondly, a couple of things. As I always threaten to do, I have a podcast in mind, and every time I'm on, I mention how I'm going to get that podcast out, and one of these times I may actually do it. I've got a couple of writing projects in the back of my mind, and I'm just starting to go into planning for the second annual horror movie marathon for suicide prevention. Over a weekend, in 2.5 days, I try to watch 20 horror movies I've never seen before. And the idea is to do that, to get people to donate money for suicide prevention. This year, I want to try to add more interactive features, like having people choose the movies, and maybe see if I can put together some prizes. But I like to watch movies, and might as well turn it into something that's useful.
Well, definitely keep me in mind for that when you do it, because I would love to donate to that. And then, yeah, if you do, maybe do things like for $25, you get to choose a movie or something like that. So then you're tying both of those things in at the same time.
Yeah, that's great.
A good idea.
Finding a horror movie that you haven't seen, though, I don't know how easy or difficult that will be.
It's a lot easier if you pick between the years of the present day to 2016 when my daughter was born. A lot of blank spaces there.
I'm sure. Wow. Yeah. Thank you so much, folks, for being on the show. Thanks to everybody for listening. If you want to hear more of me shooting off my mouth, check out some of the other shows that I work on. They are all available at weirdingwaymedia.com. Thanks especially to our Patreon community. If you want to join the community, visit patreon.com/projection booth. Every donation we get helps the projection booth take over the world.
Venez. Approchez-vous du cerveau moniteur. Je suis là.